the equity markets are concerned. Now let's talk about the World Trade Organization. After 5 days of hectic negotiations, the World Trade Organization's 164 members have approved a series of trade agreements in Geneva and Switzerland. This includes commitments on fishing, and pledges on health and food security. It wasn't an easy task, though, as per information that we've been sourcing. At one stage, the series of demands from India looked like they would paralyze the WTO talks, but a middle ground has been struck. So let's put it in context: what has worked out for India, the World Trade discussion this time around, and what really hasn't. Up front, India positioned itself as a champion of poor farmers and fishermen. So first, let's talk about fishing. The members of WTO, they've agreed to reduce the subsidies that were given out indiscriminately by developed countries. The charge was that it causes overfishing and doesn't leave enough fish for the developing countries. Talks about this have been going on for 20 years. So now what's the agreement on this? It has been agreed that no WTO member shall grant any subsidy for vessels or operators that are engaged in illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing or for fishing of any overfished stock. Very importantly, developing countries will be exempt from this for a span of 2 years. So this is considered a good win for India. Then on the COVID front, India, along with South Africa and other developing countries, had been seeking this waiver of intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines, for COVID treatments, for diagnostics related to COVID. And you had the developed countries, on the other hand. They had major pharmaceutical producers. They were opposing this move. What has happened now at WTO about this? Well, India and developing countries clearly have the upper hand. For 5 years, now they will be allowed to authorize the use of a patent for production and supply without the consent of the patent holder. And the production need not be predominantly for the domestic market, which means that more exports are allowed to ensure equitable access around the world. And the 5 years could be extended in the future too. So India had also been seeking that waiver on therapeutics, on diagnostics. Yes, that hasn't happened, but WTO members are going to consider doing this. It could happen within the next 6 months. Then there was the vexing issue of food security. WTO members have agreed to a binding decision not to curb exports to the World Food Programme. What are these exports to the World Food Programme? They are necessarily to fight hunger in places that are hit by conflicts, by disasters, by climate change. So those are out of the export limitations. It has been agreed that members would still be free to adopt measures to ensure their own food security, which is again a big win for India. This is what India had been asking for. It comes after that wheat export ban that was imposed by the Indian government. Then for e-commerce, WTO members have extended that moratorium that has been in place since the year 1998, which applies on customs duties that are levied on electronic transmissions. And that applies to streaming services, to financial transactions, to corporate data flows. Now that would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Both India, along with South Africa here, they had all along been opposing an extension because they did not want to miss out on customs revenues. This hasn't quite gone the way for India. The extension to the moratorium is going to run into the next ministerial conference that will be held at the end of 2023. But whether or not that meeting happens, the moratorium will necessarily end on the 31st of March 2024. The Commerce Minister leading the Indian delegation at WTO, Piyush Goyal, has termed this a major win for India. He says, and I quote him here, "A few countries attempted to create a false campaign initially on Sunday and Monday that India is obstinate, due to which no progress is being made. The real situation has emerged before us all. The issues raised by India, which the Prime Minister had asked us to focus upon, now the whole world acknowledges that was the correct agenda, and ultimately India played a vital role in arriving at all solutions." That's what we got from Piyush Goyal. Listen in to what he said.
एग्री करें तो 100% भारत सफल हुआ है। आज ऐसा कोई विषय नहीं है जिसमें हमें जरा भी किसी प्रकार की चिंता के साथ भारत लौटना है। चाहे हमारे किसान भाई बहनों के चिंता हो, जिसमें हमने किसी भी प्रकार का एमएसपी पे जो खाद्य भारत खरीदता है, जो भारत का पब्लिक स्टॉक होल्डिंग प्रोग्राम है, जो हम भारत के गरीब लोगों को जिस प्रकार से अनाज देने में खाद्य सुरक्षा के माध्यम से भी, और प्रधानमंत्री गरीब कल्याण अन्न योजना.
From the Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal in Geneva in Switzerland, where the WTO meeting was happening and he was leading the Indian delegation there. Let's understand this and get perspective on it. Jayant Dasgupta is the former ambassador and former permanent representative of India to the World Trade Organization, and he's here to explain the importance of these negotiations. Mr. Dasgupta, it's a pleasure having you with us. A very good evening. And it seems like the Indian government is very happy with what it's been able to achieve at the World Trade Organization meeting. What are your immediate takeaways from India's stance and what it has been able to get the countries to approve? Because, yes, there was a lot of pushback for what India was proposing, but ultimately the negotiations seem to have gone India's way. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's been a mixed bag, I must say. There have been areas in which India has secured what it wanted. There have been other areas where India has had to make compromises, but it has left the door open for further negotiations. I will just take up two issues. The first one is about fisheries subsidies. Now, India was always in agreement with the other countries that illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing should not attract any subsidies. The same was with regard to overfished stocks. No subsidies should be provided. The problem was about building up fishing infrastructure, including fishing vessels, landing stations, processing ships, etc., which the Western countries and some other countries like Korea, China, Taiwan, etc., have built up by subsidization. Now, there was a proposal to limit that for developing countries and LDCs also, especially developing countries like India, Indonesia, etc. Now, India has just embarked on providing subsidies for building up fishing infrastructure through the Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana. Now, with an outlay of 20,000 crores. And mind you, all the countries which are very strong in marine fishing, they have all built up their fishing infrastructure through government subsidies. So India's position was that the countries which have already subsidized and built up their fishing infrastructure should not get away with that and prevent India and a few other countries from building up their infrastructure, because that provides a lot of livelihood and incomes to our poor fishermen.
That's right.
So India asked for a 25-year carve-out. That was not agreed upon, but India also stood its ground along with Indonesia. So what has happened is that the chapter has not been closed completely, but it has been said that it will get negotiated.
Right.
And there is a provision that it has to be negotiated within the next 4 years.
Right.
Now, every decision in the WTO is taken by consensus. So India will have its say in terms of building up its fishing infrastructure. So there, I think it has been a signal victory.
Mr. Dasgupta, I wanted to ask you about food security in particular, because that has been a clear bone of contention. When the wheat export ban was announced, it did create a flutter. How much ground has India been able to achieve at the WTO when it comes to food security for developing countries, and what India's stance on this has been all along?
Well, in 1948, when the GATT came into force and it has carried over to the WTO agreement, there is a clear provision that a country can put export restrictions or import restrictions to address critical shortages. So India has been and is well within its rights to put export restrictions on the exports of wheat or certain restrictions on sugar. That is well within its rights. The point is that India wanted to have freedom to export from its public stock holdings, which have been procured at minimum support prices, whether it was rice or wheat. Now, the peace clause which was negotiated, which allows public stock holdings to be held by governments for food security purposes, that has a clause which was inserted, which said that you cannot export from these public stock holdings which have been procured at MSP. India was wanting to have that changed. And one of the demands of India was that there should be a permanent solution to this public stockholding issue. That has not been agreed upon. But the door has not shut on that. So there is still hope that at some future point of time, it will get resolved. The point is that the peace clause is in operation.
Correct.
So India can procure food as long as it wants to, till a permanent solution is reached.
Mr. Dasgupta, to put it in a nutshell, how do you think India's stance at the WTO in pushing its agenda, how has that changed compared to what we've seen it do in the recent past in terms of strategy and getting countries on board? Have we done it with a new amount of aggression, or is that just political posturing? How do you read India's push at the WTO to get what is on its agenda through to the countries on board?
Well, I wouldn't take a view on the political aspect of the negotiations, but I must say that India has had a consistent record since the GATT days of fighting for its rights and securing what it considers to be important. The peace clause was negotiated in 2013, and it was a kind of a trade-off against the trade facilitation agreement. The peace clause continues till this date. As far as the gains from this round of ministerial discussions is concerned, India has secured two things. One, fisheries subsidies. There will be nothing to limit the prospects of India to provide subsidies for building up its fishing infrastructure. The second point is on TRIPS. India was of the view that there should be, and South Africa and 63 other countries, that there should be a temporary waiver of TRIPS for the production of vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics for tackling the COVID pandemic. The issue is that the talks were restricted to vaccines, and in vaccines, there has been some progress. But it is basically about compulsory licensing and about allowing compulsory licenses to be issued for production of medicines, not primarily for domestic use, but for exports also. So that is a positive development.
Absolutely. So like you said, it is a mixed bag. But the way it is coming across from the words put out by the Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal, it does sound like a big win for India. But thank you so much for putting that in perspective for us in terms of the hits and misses that we've had. And of course, there will be more clarity that will emerge. A lot needs to be discussed even further, and that has been pushed back to the next meeting that will take place. But for the moment, that's where we're leaving it, Mr. Das.